In the mouth, the bone holding the bottom row of teeth is the mandible, and the bone holding the top row of teeth is the maxilla. The mandible and the maxilla, like most bones in the human body, have a core of less dense cancellous bone wrapped in an outer layer of more dense alveolar bone. The part of the mandible and maxilla that are in the mouth are covered by the gums, and the teeth rest in bony sockets within the mandible and maxilla and are surrounded by the gums. Usually, at about 6 months of age, infants will have their first pair of deciduous teeth, also called milk teeth or baby teeth, that erupt through the gums and into the mouth. New deciduous teeth continue to erupt every 1 to 2 months until the baby is around 2 years old and has a full set of deciduous teeth. Since the mouth is symmetrically divided down the middle, let's just look at one side of it. The teeth that pair up vertically have the same names. Starting at the front of the mouth, in the center, there are the central incisors and then the lateral incisors. These teeth are shaped like chisels, and they're good at biting off small bits of food. Next are the canines, which got their name from being the same teeth that are extra long and sharp in dogs. They're also called cuspids, which comes from the word cusp, meaning point. They're good for puncturing holes, tearing things, and they're also an essential part of any vampire costume. Both incisors and canines typically have one root each. Then, there are the first molars and the second molars. Molars usually have 4 to 5 cusps and are great for crushing and grinding food. That makes 20 deciduous teeth in total. As the permanent teeth grow in the bone below the deciduous teeth throughout childhood, the roots of the deciduous teeth begin to get absorbed into the gums. This loosens them and allows them to fall out, making room for the permanent teeth to take their places. These permanent teeth are also called the adult teeth or the succedaneous teeth, which means to succeed or follow after. Usually, children begin to lose their teeth starting around age 6, and the process finishes around age 12. As the permanent teeth move in, a few more types of teeth begin to show up. Starting from the center of the mouth again, the permanent teeth include the central and lateral incisors, and then the canines, just like before. But then, the teeth that replace the deciduous molars are called the first and second premolars, or bicuspids. As the name of bicuspid suggests, they have 2 cusps each, and each one has a root. Just like the molars, these teeth are great for crushing and grinding food. As the jawbones grow throughout adolescence, they make room for a few new teeth toward the back of the mouth. The first permanent molars usually appear around age 6, and the second permanent molars around age 12. The third permanent molars, or wisdom teeth, usually don't erupt until around the ages of 17 to 25, but sometimes they never erupt, and they remain impacted in the jaw, or they simply aren't present at all. While the upper molars typically have 3 roots, the bottom molars have only 2. Altogether, that makes up 32 permanent teeth. Now, let's build a model of a tooth and its surrounding structures. Each bony socket is lined on the inside by a periodontal ligament. Protecting the alveolus on the outside is a layer of soft, supportive tissue called the gingiva, or gums, that sit on top of the bone and surround the teeth. The gums meet the tooth at the cemento-enamel junction, where the cementum and the enamel come together. The cemento-enamel junction is called the cervical area of the tooth. Cervical means neck, so you can think of this area as the neck of the tooth. The gums surround it like a shirt collar. The tooth itself can be roughly divided into a few parts. The first part is the root, and it sits within the bone. Teeth can either have 1 or multiple roots, and this varies from person to person. The root is covered by the cementum, which is a bone-like substance that the periodontal ligament's fibers are attached to. Next, there's the neck, which is the transition period between the root portion covered by the bone and the crown. The crown is the visible part of the tooth that protrudes from the gingiva, and it's covered in enamel, which has a high mineral content, and it's the hardest substance in the human body. Now, when teeth are developing, enamel is made before the tooth erupts into the mouth by a group of cells called the amyloblasts that die once the tooth erupts, so the tooth loses its ability to make more enamel forever. About 1% of enamel's weight is from an organic matrix of proteins, and about 96% of it is mineralized by a substance similar to hydroxyapatite, which is the substance that gives bone much of its hardness. As a comparison, dentin is only around 70% mineralized, and cementum is around 65%. The portion of gingiva that sticks up and is not anchored to the tooth is sometimes called the free gingiva, and the space between the free gingiva and the crown is called the gingival crevice, or gingival sulcus. This space has a tiny bit of gingival crevicular fluid, which contains various immune proteins and cells like neutrophils, complement proteins, and antibodies. This fluid helps protect against overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria. You see, in a healthy mouth, there's a balance of commensal bacteria that compete with each other, and they're all kept in check by immune factors like the gingival crevicular fluid in the mouth. Alright, now let's fill the tooth in from the inside out. Blood vessels and nerves come from the jawbones and enter the center of the root through a narrow passage, called the apical foramen. From there, they travel through the root canal and enter the soft center of the tooth, called the pulp, where they provide nutrition and sensation. The outer wall of the pulp contains odontoblasts, which are cells that secrete dentin. The odontoblasts have long processes, or arms, that lay within tiny tubules in the dentin, like an octopus sticking its arms through a block of cement. These arms allow them to monitor and repair the dentin as needed throughout life, unlike enamel. These tubules are important for sensory nerves as well, which use them to travel through the dentin from the pulp to the dentin-enamel junction. The nerves that provide the sensations of touch, pain, and changes in temperature to the teeth are all branches of the trigeminal nerve, also known as the cranial nerve 5. Its second main branch is the maxillary nerve, which innervates the upper row of teeth with many smaller branches, most notably the superior alveolar nerves. The trigeminal nerve's third main branch is called the mandibular nerve, which innervates the bottom row of teeth with multiple branches as well, most notably the inferior alveolar nerve. In terms of blood supply, oxygenated blood leaves the heart and a portion travels through the external carotid artery, which gives off a branch called the maxillary artery. Its small branches supply both rows of teeth. Deoxygenated blood leaves the pulp and ends up in the maxillary vein, which travels back towards the heart. Alright, as a quick recap, the deciduous teeth start to erupt around 6 months of age, and this continues to happen every 1 or 2 months until the baby is around 2 years old. While there are 20 deciduous teeth, there are 32 permanent teeth in total. The shape of each tooth gives it a specialized function for chewing food. The root of each tooth is covered by cementum, the crown is covered in enamel, and dentin covers the pulp, which contains blood vessels and nerves. Branches of the trigeminal nerve provide sensation to the teeth, while the maxillary artery provides oxygenated blood.
The gastrointestinal tract consists of a long tube that food travels through, which runs from the mouth to the anus, as well as to a number of helpful accessory organs that sprout off the sides of that tube. The gastrointestinal tract is made up of the mouth, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, and finally the anal canal. The accessory organs include the teeth, tongue, salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and the pancreas. The main job of the gastrointestinal system is ingestion, taking in food, digestion, breaking it down into nutrients, absorption, pulling these nutrients into the bloodstream, and finally, excretion, getting rid of waste. Alright, so let's say we eat a slice of pizza. The pizza goes in our oral cavity where we use our teeth to masticate or chew the food up into small fragments. These fragments get tasted and rolled around by the tongue, which is basically a huge muscle that lines the floor of the mouth. The roof of the mouth, which separates it from the nasal cavity, is made up by the anterior hard palate, which provides a hard surface for the tongue to mash food against, and the posterior soft palate, which moves together along with the pendulum-like uvula to form a flap, or valve, that helps make sure food flows down instead of going up into the nose. At the same time, the three sets of salivary glands, the sublingual below the tongue, the submandibular below the mandible, and the parotid gland, which is near the ear, all secrete saliva to lubricate the food. The saliva helps to compact the food down into a soft, warm ball called a bolus. Saliva also contains salivary amylase, an enzyme that breaks long carbohydrates down into smaller sugars. Once that bolus of food gets swallowed through the pharynx, it goes into the esophagus. Right at that moment, there's a spoon-shaped flap of cartilage called the epiglottis, which acts like a lid and seals the airway off so that the food doesn't end up in the lungs by accident. Now if we zoom into a cross-section of the rest of the gastrointestinal tract, anywhere from the esophagus to the anus, the walls are typically lined by the same 4 layers of tissue. The outermost layer is either the adventitia, a thick fibrous connective tissue, or the serosa, a slippery serous membrane. Next is the muscularis externa, a smooth muscle layer which contracts automatically without you even having to think about it. If we look closer at this muscle layer, we'll see it's actually composed of an inner circular muscle layer arranged in circular rings which contract and constrict the tract behind the food, which keeps it from moving backward, while the outer longitudinal muscle layer, arranged along the length of the tract, relaxes and lengthens and therefore pulls things forward. Together, they perform what's called peristalsis, which is a series of coordinated wave-like muscle contractions that help squeeze the food bolus in one direction. In specific places along the tract, like the esophageal sphincter, the circular layer thickens, forming these sphincters that keep food from passing from one part of the gastrointestinal tract to another. Also, between the circular and longitudinal muscle layer, there's a plexus, or network of nerves, which helps coordinate muscle contraction and relaxation. This is the myenteric plexus, also called the Auerbach's plexus, which when activated causes smooth muscle relaxation. Now, surrounded by the muscularis externa is the submucosa, which consists of a dense layer of tissue that contains blood vessels, lymphatics, and nerves. Specifically, buried in the submucosa there's a second plexus, the submucous plexus, also called the Meissner's plexus, which is responsible for helping to control the size of the blood vessels, as well as the secretion of digestive juices. And finally, there's the inner lining of the intestine called the mucosa, which itself consists of 3 cell layers. The outermost layer of the mucosa is the muscularis mucosa, or muscularis interna, and it's a layer of smooth muscle that contracts and helps break down food. The middle layer is the lamina propria, and it contains blood and lymph vessels. Finally, there's the innermost epithelial layer, and it absorbs and secretes mucus and digestive enzymes because this is the layer that comes into direct contact with food. Now, the esophagus has a particularly thick muscularis externa that propels the bolus of food down to the esophageal sphincter, which opens, allowing the bolus to pass into the stomach. In the stomach, there are 4 regions: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pyloric antrum. There's also a pyloric sphincter or valve at the end of the stomach, which closes while eating, keeping food inside for the stomach to churn over and over again. To help churn the food, the stomach has an extra layer of oblique smooth muscle within its muscularis externa that allows it to contract and expand like a big accordion. Also, the inner lining of the stomach has millions of tiny gastric pits that dive down into the gastric glands. These glands contain a variety of secretory cells which produce gastric secretions. Gastric secretions are made up of hydrochloric acid, which help destroy any pathogens that slip through the food, an enzyme called pepsin, which chops up proteins, mucus, which protects the stomach, as well as water, which turns the bolus into a liquidy pulp called chyme. Now, once the stomach is done doing what stomachs do, the pyloric sphincter opens, allowing the chyme to pass into the small intestine. The small intestine has 3 parts: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And despite its name, the small intestine can be as long as 10.5 meters, or about 35 feet, with lots of tiny ridges and grooves, each of which projects little finger-like fibers called villi. And in turn, each villus is covered in teeny tiny little microvilli. All of this gives the small intestines plenty of surface area to absorb nutrients. But almost no nutrient absorption can take place without the help of the trio of accessory organs: the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. First up, the liver is a massive organ that sits under the right dome of the diaphragm, and it makes bile. So, going back to that pizza slice, at this point, the fats in the cheese are part of the chyme, and that stimulates the enteroendocrine cells, or hormone secreting cells, of the small intestine to secrete a hormone, called cholecystokinin, into the blood. The cholecystokinin makes its way to the gallbladder, the thin walled green sac snuggling up against the liver. It signals it to squeeze out some bile through the cystic and bile ducts into the small intestine. This is pretty much your gallbladder's job. Store and concentrate the bile that's made by the liver until the time comes to squirt it out into the small intestine. That bile emulsifies the fat, essentially making fat organize into small micelles, which are tiny bubbles of mixed lipids and bile acids, rather than disorganized clumps, which makes them easier to absorb. And this is where the pancreas comes in. The pancreas is a long, skinny gland the length of a dollar bill, snuggled around the duodenum. Cholecystokinin stimulates acinar cells in the pancreas to secrete digestive enzymes that travel through the pancreatic ducts and into the duodenum. One enzyme is pancreatic lipase, which grabs the triglycerides hanging out in those micelles and breaks them down into fatty acids and glycerol. There's also pancreatic amylase, which breaks down carbohydrates into shorter oligosaccharides, and proteases, like trypsin, which cleaves proteins down into smaller peptides. Now, to prevent the hydrochloric acid of the stomach from damaging the intestinal mucosa, enteroendocrine cells also secrete another hormone, called secretin, which stimulates the pancreatic duct cells to secrete water and bicarbonate. Bicarbonate helps neutralize the acidic chyme. Raising the pH of the intestinal lumen also helps digestive enzymes work more effectively. A generous amount of bicarbonate is also secreted by a number of glands lying in the submucosa of the duodenal wall. At this point, we're almost ready for absorption. Fatty acids and glycerol can easily pass through the small intestinal epithelium and into the lymphatics. But to help absorb sugars, there are special enzymes on the top surface or brush border of the intestinal cells called brush border enzymes. These are maltase, sucrase, and lactase, which break down the short chains of sugars called oligosaccharides into simple sugars called monosaccharides. These include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Similarly, there are peptidases which break down peptide chains into single amino acids. The epithelial cells can absorb these nutrients into the bloodstream, and from there, they can go to the various tissues around the body. Alright, so whatever isn't absorbed, like fiber, continues its journey onward through the ileocecal sphincter and into the very last part of the gastrointestinal tract, the large intestine, also known as the colon. The large intestine is basically a 1.5 meter or 5 foot long loop that frames the small intestine and consists of 6 parts. The cecum, which has this tiny worm-like little outpouching called the appendix, the ascending colon that climbs along the right side of the abdomen, the transverse colon right beneath the diaphragm, the descending colon running down the left side of the abdomen, the S-shaped sigmoid colon, and finally, the rectum. When chyme hits the cecum, it's met by trillions of bacteria that colonize the large intestine. They're collectively called the gut microbiome. This microbiome is still trying to be studied and understood, but we know that the bacteria help produce essential B and K vitamins, as well as gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfurous compounds, which sometimes get released in awkward moments. The chyme slowly moves through the large intestine via small waves of peristalsis that take place over hours or even days. The large intestine absorbs excess water from the chyme, and that helps condense it into dry fecal matter. And that feces eventually ends up in the rectum. Once the rectum is filled and stretched, signals travel to the parasympathetic neurons in the spinal cord, initiating the defecation reflex. These parasympathetic neurons make the rectum contract and the internal anal sphincter relax. Meanwhile, signals are sent to the brainstem and thalamus, and when these decide the right moment has come, they allow the external anal sphincter to relax, and feces goes, hopefully, into the toilet bowl. Alright, as a quick recap. Food is ingested through the mouth, chewed by the teeth, mixed with saliva, and turned into a bolus. The bolus is then moved by peristalsis through the esophagus and into the stomach, where hydrochloric acid is secreted and pepsin begins the digestion process. Next is the small intestine, where most of the digestion and absorption occurs with the help of the liver's bile coming from the gallbladder and the pancreatic enzymes. Finally, the large intestine absorbs water, The feces forms and gets excreted through the anus. When chyme hits the cecum, it's met by trillions of bacteria, microbiomes, and gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and sulfurous compounds, which sometimes get released in awkward moments.
Your liver lies just below your diaphragm, in the right upper quadrant of your abdominal cavity. And it does a wide range of things, from helping to manage the body's metabolism, detoxification, and bile production. The surface of the liver is covered by a serous membrane called the visceral peritoneum. The visceral peritoneum folds over on itself, and it suspends the liver from the abdominal wall and the diaphragm. There are 5 of these peritoneal folds, and they're referred to as ligaments. There's the falciform ligament, which attaches the liver to the anterior wall of the abdominal cavity. There's the round ligament of the liver, which is a fibrous cord found in the free margin of the falciform ligament. There's the coronary ligament, which attaches the liver to the inferior surface of the diaphragm. There's the right triangular ligament, which is a small triangular fold which attaches the right lateral surface of the liver to the diaphragm. And lastly, there's the left triangular ligament, which attaches the upper left surface of the liver to the diaphragm. Now, viewed from above, the liver is divided by the falciform ligament into 2 main lobes, the larger right lobe and the smaller left lobe. When viewed from below, the liver has 2 additional lobes between the right and the left lobe, the posterior caudate lobe and the anterior quadrate lobe. These 2 lobes are separated by the porta hepatis, which literally means the gate to the liver. Now, the porta hepatis contains the hepatic artery, the hepatic portal vein, and the common hepatic duct. The hepatic artery delivers oxygen-rich arterial blood from the heart to the liver, while the hepatic portal vein delivers nutrient-rich venous blood from the gastrointestinal tract, but also from the spleen and pancreas. Lastly, the common hepatic duct drains bile from the liver into the gallbladder. Now let's take a closer look inside a section of the liver, which shows the functional units of the liver called hepatic lobules. Each hepatic lobule looks like a tiny hexagon. At the periphery of the hepatic lobule, there are portal triads, which are made up of a branch of the hepatic artery, a branch of the portal vein, and 1 or 2 small bile ducts. Now, these branches of the hepatic artery and the portal vein both drain into very porous blood vessels called sinusoids, which carry blood toward the center of the lobule and drain into the central vein. From central veins, the blood flows into the hepatic veins and eventually drains into the inferior vena cava. Now, back in the sinusoids, oxygen and nutrients are able to get through pores in the sinusoids and enter the underlying hepatocytes. Hepatocytes take in oxygen and nutrients and deposit carbon dioxide into the blood, like every other cell in the body. But in addition, they also pick up and detoxify harmful substances, like drugs or alcohol. Hepatocytes help maintain a normal blood glucose level. When blood glucose levels are high, like after eating a meal, hepatocytes convert glucose into a storage molecule called glycogen, using a process called glycogenesis. But when glucose levels are low, the hepatocytes break down the glycogen back into glucose, in a process called glycogenolysis. In addition to glycogen, hepatocytes also store certain vitamins, like A, D, E, K, and B12, as well as some minerals like iron and copper. The liver also removes the amine group from amino acids, using a process called deamination, so that the amino acids metabolize to help produce ATP. Hepatocytes also synthesize a variety of important proteins, like albumin and coagulation factors, which gets secreted into the blood. Lastly, these cells also regulate lipid metabolism. They break down fatty acids in order to generate ATP, using a process called beta oxidation. Hepatocytes also synthesize 2 types of lipoproteins: very low density lipoproteins, or VLDL, and high-density lipoproteins, or HDL. VLDLs help transport triglycerides, fatty acids, and cholesterol to cells that use them as energy, or to adipocytes that store them. On the other hand, HDLs transport cholesterol from the peripheral cells and tissues back to the liver, where they're broken down to generate energy. If you're still not impressed with your liver, consider the fact that you can donate up to 90% of your liver and the remaining 10% can grow it back. Kind of like a starfish that can regrow its arms. Very impressive, liver. Very impressive. Now, speaking of starfish, if we zoom back into the hepatic sinusoid, we'll notice star-shaped cells called Kupffer cells. Kupffer cells are modified macrophages, and they're also called stellate reticuloendothelial cells. They destroy old red and white blood cells, as well as bacteria and other foreign substances that enter the sinusoids. Now, the liver is also involved in bile synthesis, which is very important for digestion and absorption of fats and fat-soluble vitamins in the small intestine. Hepatocytes convert cholesterol into bile salts, which along with water and bilirubin make up bile. Bile is secreted into bile ducts, called bile caniculi, found between adjacent hepatocytes. From here, the bile flows first into the bile ductules and then into the bile ducts, which are part of the portal triad. So in contrast to blood, which flows from the portal triad toward the central vein, bile flows from the center of the lobule to the portal triad. The bile ducts then unite to form the larger right and left hepatic ducts, which eventually merge to form the common hepatic duct. The common hepatic duct then leads to the cystic duct, which brings the bile to the gallbladder. The gallbladder is a small, pear-shaped hollow organ located beneath the liver, and this is where bile is stored and becomes more concentrated. Alright, as a quick recap. The liver lies just below your diaphragm, in the right upper quadrant of your abdominal cavity, and it has a wide range of functions, including metabolism, detoxification, production of proteins important for blood clotting, and bile production. The place where the blood vessels enter the liver while the common hepatic duct leaves it is referred to as the porta hepatis. Lastly, the main functional unit of the liver is the hepatic lobule, which has a specific hexagonal shape and it consists of 4 main parts: the portal triad, hepatic sinusoids, hepatocytes, and a central vein.